Hi, and thanks so much for choosing the Sierra Bible Church Sermon of the Week. We hope you enjoy this message by Pastor Nate Levery.
It's so good. Good to worship. Good to be together. Happy Easter, especially if you're brand new here. Yeah. Thank you to the team, of course, for bringing us into this place of worship. Just a couple days before the events that we know as the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, things in the Jesus camp were sort of escalating. Jesus was saying some things. The disciples were getting a bit troubled by them, not sure exactly what would come next. They certainly knew things were about to change. Jesus sort of calls them in, and as a result of a couple of questions, sort of gives them three statements to ground and to shape what they would soon experience in their lives. They're phrases we've looked at these last couple weeks as we've moved toward this morning, celebrating Easter together. Jesus said this as if to kind of anchor their hearts and their minds to the truth of who he was. He said things are going to go all kinds of different directions here for a bit, but know this: I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. Jesus said, I am the way, I am the pathway to peace. Stick with me. Walk with me. I am the truth. Whatever you see me do, whatever you hear me say, it isn't just true for us. It isn't just true for this moment. It's true for all people in every way for all of time. And then lastly, what brings us to today, Jesus said these words, I am the life. And this conversation about life and death is actually the most ancient of conversations. And yet it has for us everything to say about today. Do you remember back to the very, very first conversation that we have recorded in human history? It's God with Adam and Eve in the garden. He's put them there to enjoy him, to enjoy all that he's given them. And then he gives them this kind of odd warning as if to say that you were created as a human, like the billions after you, a particular way. You were created to be a worshiper, not a God. And he said, actually, you're here in this garden to enjoy everything. Enjoy this life. I've made it for you. I've made you for it. But there's a tree in the middle of it. Don't eat its fruit. This tree represents your desire to be like me, to be in control, to be in charge. It's as if God is saying, if you eat of this fruit, it will actually rewire the very way you were created to live and to worship. If you grasp, God says, after my role, you will surely, God says, die. Not knowing, I'm sure, what Jesus was, or God was talking about at that time, they go on, enter the serpent, the one Jesus would soon call the father of all lies. He starts, of course, by twisting the words of God, and then he takes us to this place where he ultimately just kind of lays it down. And he says, you have God's truth, you have my truth. My truth, Satan says, is you will not surely die. God's lying, God's holding something out. He doesn't know what's best for you. Thinking the serpent more wise than their creator and seeing the fruit, they ate and they died. I mean, but if we're honest and we've read the story before, we've got to ask ourselves, did they really die? Well, something history tells us with amazing consistency certainly died in that moment. You see, their innocence was replaced with a crisis of identity. The peace that God had created them for was replaced with a lifelong power struggle. The love they were created to enjoy turned to jealousy. Gladness was replaced with grief and shame. You see, in that fruit, in that grasp, something very much like death took place deep inside the human soul. Paul, many years later, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, is trying to put some of this together for us. And he says it this way in Romans chapter 5. He says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, through our grasping to be God rather than worship God, and death, that word, right? It came through sin. It was a result of that sin. So what does that have to do with us? Okay, Adam and Eve experienced that, but what about us? Paul goes on. He says, and in this way, death came to who? All people. All people. Death came as a result because all people sinned. Because all people sinned. And yet even here in their grasping to be God, God meets them as he does us with a promise. His grace meets them with hope that one day the God that had created them to enjoy all things and enjoy a relationship with him would come again and would restore from death this sort of breath he had breathed into them that had been smoked out as a result of their sin. One would come and life would come again. This is the promise we get even in those early days. And then listen to how John invites us into this day, the John 20 day. John says in sort of Bible speak these words. He says, on the first day of a new week. Remember what time it was? Man, it looked a little bit like this morning, right? Still very dark outside, John says. While it was really early. This is sort of the Bible's way of saying that this is a sort of hinge of history. God is up to something new. This is a new creation day. Mary arrives at the tomb to do what? Do you remember? To grieve. She sees that the tomb is empty. She assumes, of course, as you would, that the body has been stolen. She runs. There's a lot of running in this passage, as you saw, more than any other in the Bible. She runs up and she grabs Peter and she grabs John, these two sort of stalwarts. We know Peter just kind of walked away, but he's still a leader in the church. She grabs them, and what does she say? He is risen. And what do Peter and John say? Hallelujah, he is risen. No, they don't say that at all. She says, guys, somebody's stolen his body. You see, nobody was looking for nobody. They didn't have a framework within their worldview that there would be a one time for one person and maybe for all, as we soon will see, resurrection right in the middle of history. It wasn't even something that they could conceive of from their perspective. And so she runs to them, lets them know somebody's stolen the body. John and Peter, right? It's fun how John describes this. John, he self-describes himself throughout his gospel as the one that Jesus loved, and he's also the author of this book. And it's as if there's like a starting line when Mary says the tomb is missing the body, and they take off running. Remember who John says gets there first? He does. He repeats this a few times. By the way, the guy that got there first, and it says that he stoops in and he looked. He saw. He uses of his experience a particular Greek word. It's really a very common way of saying, I looked. And maybe like some of you this morning even, you would say that as you've come to this sort of crazy idea that one stepped into the middle of history and was raised from the grave, you sort of have stayed at a distance, if we're honest for a second. And you can put these words up, you have kind of this is the Greek word, it's blepo. It's just you sort of stay at a distance. It doesn't really concern you. You're not sure yet. You don't really want to go all in. And so you, like John, sort of stay on the outside. But Peter, he's way different, right? True to form. What does Peter do? Peter busts right through John. He's catching his breath, of course, because he's been chugging along trying to catch up with John. But he breaks right in. And what does John say Peter does as he stands in the middle of the tomb? He theoreos. The English translation of that word is the same thing, he sees. But it's a word that means he looks at the evidence. He looks analytic. He doesn't stand on the outside of the tomb. He gets right in the middle of it. And he begins to do the math. A tomb that was guarded by soldiers that would lose their life if the body was taken. A massive stone that somehow was rolled away, seemingly from the inside. And then these interesting details, right, that we read together from John 20. He sees in the corner, as his eyes are kind of adjusting to the early morning light in this cave, he sees the grave clothes. And they catch his eye because they're sort of like stacked up next to the face shroud of Jesus. Not torn off, not stolen like they would have had the body been taken by grave robbers, but stacked as if to say in that moment, while Peter considers the evidence, hey, we served our purpose and we're done. You see what John is inviting us into by helping us consider what Peter does in this moment is the truth that the resurrection is reasonable. Look at the evidence. Ask your questions. Read the eyewitness accounts. Talk to other people who seem a little crazy maybe from your perspective, but they're walking with this one who rose some 2,000 years ago. Look, see. Let me just invite us to consider for a moment the upside and the downside of getting the resurrection wrong. A couple weeks ago, I was doing some landscaping things, and one of my buddies owns a landscaping place, and their little yard is out on Campo Seco Road and 49 there. So we're out there getting a few supplies for the church, and we're hanging out. Well, they're getting a building done, much like we're going to start breaking ground if the weather ever cooperates out here for our students. And they're breaking ground, so there's a big excavator. We're standing in the middle of Columbia, and I said to my buddy, do you ever imagine, while you're out here in the midst of sort of the gold country, digging in and clanking onto what? A big chunk of gold. And he kind of looked back at me and he said, nah, I don't think that'll ever happen. And I said, well, Dean, if it ever does happen, feel free to call me first. I said, I'll come investigate it. Why? And if you got that call, why would you drop what you're doing and go find out? Because the upside is pretty high. We'd pay off the building and my kids' school, right? And this is the resurrection. And yet some of us, like John, stay on the outside. Consider the upside. From day one, it was death. But there's life in him. And John says, take a look, consider the evidence. Maybe you would want to start by just simply asking what historians have begun to ask, modern ones especially. And they've kind of asked this, if people were making up this story, they would never, in fact, why have they claimed that the first person to see the resurrected Jesus is a what? A woman. And certainly in our day, we're like, well, of course. But not in theirs. In their day, a woman had no credible place in court at all, Roman or Jewish. And so historians look at this text just at one little piece of evidence planted right in the middle of this context of the story we're reading today. And in each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's a woman or women that see Jesus first. And so our historians look at that and say, they wouldn't do this if they were making this up. No one would believe it. Unless what? Unless it happened. Maybe you'd look at what social scientists have looked at for years. And they ask this question, how is it that this group of people had their entire paradigm of their worldview shattered overnight? If you've done any social science, you realize this doesn't happen. It takes time. And yet, here's a group of people who could not utter the name of God. And later that night, on day one of the first day of the week, we find that group of people saying together what Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." They became believers that a human being was actually God, and it happened overnight. I love this quote by a fairly tricky person's name to say, Shisaku Endo. Maybe you've read this before. She says this: if you don't believe in the resurrection, you will be forced to believe that something hit the disciples that was every bit as amazing. Maybe different, you might have your explanation, yet of equal force in its electrifying intensity. For if we try to explain the changed lives of the early Christians, you'll find yourself making leaps of faith as great as if you believed in the resurrection to start with it. So John invites us, look at the evidence. And yet what we see as we walk this story out and we walk our story out is this: faith, while it must be chocked full with evidence to be Christian faith, is not evidence alone. We must meet this risen Jesus. We have the incredible privilege to meet him. John does what? John runs in and his sort of this last word, horeo. Same thing in the English, CCC. Very different. What John says is happening in them. John from the outside kind of looks and stays at a distance. Peter, runs in and says, here's the evidence. What actually happened? What John does is he comes in, sees the evidence, but he believes. This is a seeing with his heart. Best way I could think about describing this is, one of the cool privileges of being around here, and not as much probably at the 8 o'clock service, although I hear a few of them this morning, but like lots of our SBC people are having babies. Sometimes they bring them by the office, because when you have a baby, you do that, I'm not exactly sure why, but you bring them by and people look at them and people like me hold them for a second. And sometimes I'll tell Kathy in the afternoon, oh, hey, so-and-so dropped by with their new baby. And she'll be like, what did they look like? And I'll be like, I didn't count all the toes and fingers, but look like a baby. Most of them are cute. But, right? Because I saw the kid, I held it for a second. But I'll never forget that first moment as a dad when the doc, after, wrapping our kid up in its little cocoon, said, Dad, do you want to hold your daughter? And man, I looked and I investigated and I wondered and I just thought, what's this going to be like someday? And how will she grow up? And oh my goodness. This is Peter looking at the evidence. But if you've ever watched the nurse or the dad or the doctor hand a baby to mom, and that baby just stops. And that baby says, this is my home. And that baby says, this is the place I want to. Don't ever hand me back to that big, grumpy old guy in the corner. And that's John seeing with his heart. That's John saying, I'm all in. That's John saying, I believe, I trust, I know. I've moved past the evidence to know. We watch this happen in the life of Mary here. Peter and John, they make their way back to their homes, probably running, if the story holds. And Mary comes back. She's in a casual conversation with some angels, which is, what you do. And while she's talking to these angels, she hears something or someone right behind her. Voice says, why are you crying, Mary? Or woman, why are you crying? She thinks it's the gardener. So do you remember what she says? She says, hey, if you know where his body is, she's broken in her grief, let me know, I'll go get it. And then she hears this word. The gardener knows her name. And in that moment, she hears Mary. And John records then this, that she turned toward her Savior. Listen to how this is written out by Dale Bruner in his commentary. I love this. Imagine if you've maybe never made that turn, maybe never heard Jesus hear your voice, or if you have, I would just invite you to go back to that moment when you first believed. He says this, he says, in the 1 or 2 seconds that this turn took, I imagine the world shifting ever so slightly on its axis, moving almost imperceptibly from BC to AD. The second before this turn, there is a woman in the deepest human despair in the agonizing presence of unconquerable death. But a second after the beginning of this turn, there is a woman in the deepest possible human elation, in the presence of the death-conquering central figure of history. He says this then, there is a new reality. Someone more final than death is alive. This is the turn. The resurrection is not just reasonable, it's personal. That our reason can only take us so far. That there's a place where Jesus invites us to know him. And what does Mary find as she seeks her Lord? She finds the same thing you and I find, that he's been looking for us the whole time. This is the gospel. He's come to seek us. Who is this Mary? She's one that we see throughout the gospels as one who at best had some mental illness issues. She's recorded in the text of having some 7 demons in her. She was a wreck for a season of her life. She is the first eyewitness. She is the one that when she turns, who does she see? But Jesus himself. He comes looking for her. This is the gospel, the best news ever. Paul would put this language then together for us in this way. He says, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this. This is how God has shown us the very thing we sing about. While we were still sinners, while we were stuck in death as a result of sin, Christ died for us. He says, for if, while we were God's enemies, while we were still dead in our sin, we were reconciled, brought back to him through the death of his son, how much more then, Paul leans in, have we, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through faith? How much more should we experience his salvation when we come in faith? God wants us, his desire for each of us is that we would turn, that we would see him, that we would experience the life that comes as a result of the payment Jesus made for us on the cross, and that we would live in the hope of the resurrection. Some have said that the resurrection is a receipt on the payment paid. If that's true, it caused me to think about something that happened recently in my life. And, one of my friends, he goes to church here. You may know him. His name's David. He and his wife own the grocery outlet downtown. And when we go out to eat, I love to ask him questions about all the people, he names a few of you, that steal things when they're in the store and like what happens. I just think it's fascinating, And he's like, oh yeah, we stand behind our one-way glass and we can just watch people coming in. He's like, it's just the way they shop. Some of them, they take a big cart into the bathroom and they come out with an empty cart and you're like, yeah. But there's just ways they shop. And he's like, we can pick them up. And he's like, and I grab them all as they leave the store, at least before it gets dark. Well, I'm fascinated by these stories and thinking about all this. And then a couple days later, I found myself in grocery outlet. And I got a cart and I'm kind of walking around. I'm thinking, I wonder if I look guilty. Like, I stopped because you're doing grocery outlet. You're like, I never knew they combined that and that, right? Milk and tea, like, oh, that should be interesting. They just get the most random things. So you have to stop. And you have to look like someone who's casing the joint. And I just remember shopping through and looking and thinking, I think that guy's eyeing me. And one of the things David would say is like, a lot of times you can pick them up in the way they dressed. So I'm thinking, I got orange Crocs on. I got green workout shorts from high school that say Sonora High on them, and I'm wearing a hoodie. I'm like, I'm doomed. So I throw a few things in, I eventually check out, and she asked me what? Would you like a receipt? I was like, oh yeah, I need a receipt. Because if David tackles me right outside the store, I want to be able to say, hey, hear me, it's been paid. You know, I know there are times you and I don't always look like the life that Jesus invited us into. There are times too in our own hearts. You know, Satan twists his truth where we might begin to think. And yet when we come to a place where we believe, where we know that Jesus came out of that grave, we trust that he has on our behalf done what we needed. He has paid in full. And let me just tell you, if anybody tackles us in the parking lot, it is Jesus' receipt that we hold up and say, it's all been paid for. It's mine. This is the invitation of life that Jesus invites us into. It's the hope, the peace that comes when we know. Mary has certainly experienced this transformation as a result of the resurrection because everything changes, right, for her. She comes as one that's going to grieve. She meets the risen Lord. What does Jesus say then in that moment? And we didn't finish it off. You can come back second service. We'll read the whole text. She's sort of holding on to Jesus. Jesus looks at her and he says, hey, don't hold on to me. This story's actually going to get better. I'm going to go, but I'm going to send my spirit to live with you and in you. And even if you get thrown in the sort of darkest of dungeons, even if you get tackled in the parking lot, even if your kids are going nuts, I will be with you. And then he turns Mary and he says, Mary, I got a job for you. I got a job. I want you to be the first one to go tell the boys, go tell the disciples, go tell everyone that you see the best news of her, that you have seen me. And we see at the very end of the story, Mary does just that. She goes. And it starts right in the middle of history. Our world changing in incredibly miraculous ways because God started with people like you and I. This is the hope, that we would hear his voice, that we would know his truth, that we would believe, and that God would change us and our world forever. Next week, we're going to start together. We invite you back, not at 8 o'clock, but we invite you back, unless you want to sing on the worship team, to take a close look at the way the world began to change in lives who were radically changed overnight. Why? Because they met the risen Jesus. Let's pray.
Thanks so much for joining us, church. We hope that you enjoyed this message. If you'd like to hear more messages like this, or if you'd like to partner with us financially, please visit sierrabible.com.